Welcome students to week 5. So this is the week where we start to shift over, where we're no longer just focusing on the phenomena of migration and trying to understand it. Now we're really looking at mission. We're looking at the response of the church to migration. So of course, we have to start by saying there's not just one response. So what we really need to look at is the variety of responses of the church to migration. And in that process, we need to look at the responses of immigrant churches, or primarily immigrant churches, and primarily non-immigrant churches. And of course, to be honest, we have to start with the many ways in which the church has joined certain sectors of society in rejection, persecution, and neglect of migrants. But we have, on the other hand, just as powerful, or perhaps even more powerful, examples of the church's engagement in hospitality. And that includes a wide variety of forms of hospitality, including the provision of social and legal services, the resettlement of refugees, and supporting migrants in their integration process, evangelism, both by immigrants and to immigrants, and Christian education, both of non-immigrant churches or even immigrant churches about immigration, and also Christian education of immigrants and of non-immigrants by immigrants. So lots of different levels of evangelism and Christian education. And then the areas of solidarity and advocacy. This is too much to talk about in one video, so we're actually doing 2 videos. But what I want to do now is I want to talk just a little bit about the historical roots of the response of the church. So the Kavanaugh book looks at a medieval understanding of how you respond to the stranger, how the church responds to the stranger. And he uses the paradigm of pilgrims and monks. That pilgrims would come through and that you were duty-bound as a Christian to provide them with hospitality, and monks did that on a regular basis, that monasteries were places of hospitality. He says that the modern lesson that we need to learn from this is that we are a pilgrim church, that we are a church who is passing through this world. We don't belong, and therefore we should naturally be in solidarity with all of those who are strangers, all of those who are passing through or coming from one place to another. And he talks about the beautiful traditions that monasteries had of welcoming Jesus and the stranger, the way that they honored every stranger in the name and spirit of Jesus, remembering Matthew 25. And he says that that should be an example for us all. Boudet, of course, talks about the concept of ecclesial solidarity. And that's a prescription for Boudet. It's not just a historical concept or experience. It's also a prescription. It's what he thinks we should be doing, that we should be treating the body of Christ as our fundamental allegiance, which contextualizes and defines all others. Not that we should have no other allegiances. He isn't trying to get rid of the family or the nation state or any of our other allegiances. He says they just have to be subordinate allegiances. And of course, historically, we see that in Acts 2 and 4, that we see the earliest members of the Christian church selling their goods and pooling their resources. So in that sense, putting the body of Christ above their families of origin. So let's look a little bit at immigrant churches. And of course, I gave you Hanseles to talk about that, but also Sorens and Yang talk about it. So Hanseles talks about the theologizing experience of migration, that when you migrate, everything is shaken up, and therefore that's an opportunity. It's an opportunity, it can be an opportunity that you respond to negatively, that people can lose their faith, or they can convert from one faith, they can convert away from Christianity, or it can be an experience of positive openness to change and conversion. So in Korea, 25% of the population is Christian, but 75% of Koreans in the US are Christian. In Taiwan, 2% of the population is Christian. In the US, 20% of the population. So it's often a time when people's openness to new ideas and new allegiances results in a conversion to Christian faith. What do immigrant churches provide immigrants? They provide immigrants with assembly, a place to come together with other people sharing the same experience, with affiliation and identity, with communal acceptance and support, with social integration, and they facilitate and ease the adjustment process. So they're very powerful in terms of their ministry to immigrants, immigrant churches. They also, though, provide church and society some important gifts. They act often as models of religious commitment. And there's a whole list of that Hanselist describes and supports. I'm just going to go through it with you, but all the in-depth information is in Hanselist or Sorensen Yang. So faithful witness, they're mostly charismatic, they're Bible believing, they promote a moral lifestyle, they believe in divine intervention in daily life, they have a distinctive spirituality, often with vibrant worship. They have a more communal ethos. They cater to the needs of the most vulnerable. They live in proximity with other marginalized groups, and so they can practice a form of incarnational evangelism that is more effective. And they tend to exhibit growth, rapid growth, through innovation. They're not frozen into a traditional way of being. And just one little statistic that jumped out at me, that from 1993 to 2005, the annual average for the Assemblies of God was to close 40 white congregations and to open 87 immigrant congregations per year. So that's a pretty dramatic demonstration of the impact of immigrant churches. Now let's look at some models for a positive response to migrants. And I'm going to go through a number of these models with you in this video, and then some of the models in the next video. We're going to talk about immigrant hope, good neighbor circles, and the Matthew 25, Mateo 25 ECAS model. We're going to talk about the Welcoming Churches Network, which is a Methodist model, and the Guardian Angels Project, which is a Lutheran model. We're going to talk about the Sanctuary Movement and the New Sanctuary Movement, the Our Children Project and the Loving the Stranger Coalition, the Evangelical Immigration Table, and a little bit about Justice for Immigrants and the Interfaith Immigration Coalition. So, immigrant hope. A number of churches provide legal services. Immigrant Hope is a distinct and comprehensive model for doing that. So their mission statement is to equip churches to provide immigrants with the hope of the gospel, help finding a pathway to legal residency, and a home in a church that cares for their needs. So they are national, and they provide, like I said, legal services, which are essential for immigrants. They also provide education, so useful classes, and those differ from place to place. In California, they provide driver's license education and English as a second language courses. They offer Bible studies, and they also replicate themselves, that they provide training for church-based legal services providers. Support circles. When immigrants come to this country, particularly when refugees come to this country, they need quite a bit of support. They come with nothing. And so churches form support circles. And I'm going to give you a couple of examples of that, organizational examples. World Relief operates the Good Neighbor Circles, which focus primarily on refugees. They've done a little bit of work on asylum seekers, but it's mostly refugees. And you have one or more churches working together to make up teams of volunteers. And the volunteers are trained and supported by World Relief staff. And they help a refugee family with what they need. So they donate needed goods, they help them find housing, work, ESL classes, set up bank accounts, figure out transportation. And it's a pretty standardized set of interventions. Matthew 25, Mateo 25, ECAS. ECAS is the Ecumenical Collaboration for Asylum Seekers. Matthew 25, Mateo 25 is a network of immigrant and non-immigrant churches that have come together to respond to the immigration crisis. ECAS is a larger collaboration. Matthew 25, Mateo 25 is primarily evangelical. ACOS, it includes Lutherans, Episcopalians, Methodists, Presbyterians that come together so that we all come together in a model of support for specifically asylum seekers. So you can see I wrote volunteers from immigrant and non-immigrant churches working together, which is essential to the model. But we also utilize a group that we call puentes, which are young, mostly millennials, some Generation Z, bilingual, bicultural Latinx church members and leaders. And they really help create, the word puente in Spanish means bridge, that they help create a bridge between the immigrant and non-immigrant churches, which makes the support circles work. They wouldn't work very well without the puentes. These support circles accompany asylum seekers, but not with a standard set of interventions or with a standard set of goals, because refugees have some access to government support in the United States, at least for the early portion of their time in the US. They have access to government support. So it's realistic to say, let's find them an apartment. Asylum seekers don't have access to any kind of support while they're in the vetting process. So they're in a very different situation. Often we are able to find people who will host them in their homes for a period of time. But the step from a home to an apartment is a difficult one, many times because their work permits have not yet come. There's some problem with the work permit. So they're essentially, if they're going to work, they're going to work under the table. So it's really a process of working towards goals that individual or family sets for themselves that are realistic. And part of what it means to be immigrants from immigrant churches working side by side with non-immigrants is that immigrants are very aware of the difficulties that these families face, and also naturally respectful of whatever choices they need to make in that process. So there isn't the kind of patronizing element that can creep in when you have people at a higher level of economic status and stability, and higher level of integration who are helping people that are newcomers. In the Matthew 25, PM537 ACOS network, you have people who have gone through it themselves side by side with people who have more resources. And those people tend to treat the asylum seekers with a more fundamental sense of mutuality and equality and respect. So that we're really looking at what are their goals, not what are our goals for them. And then as part of that ethos, which is very intentional, we also facilitate leadership development and mutual support through the family support network. So we network all the families together. We provide them therapeutic services by somebody from Latin America. So they have that kind, and we have an African group, and we provide through a therapist from Africa. So somebody that really understands the origins that they come from. And Matthew 25, PM537 ACOS also intentionally seeks to involve all of the members of the support circles as well as the family support network in advocacy. So World Relief also does advocacy, but the Good Neighbor circles are separate from the advocacy process, whereas Matthew 25, PM537 ACOS is very intentional about involving everybody in the advocacy process. And again, that partly comes from being half immigrant, that we're very aware that the law is broken and needs to change on a daily basis. So that tends to impact the way that we do the work. So the Welcoming Church Network is run by the United Methodist Church, and it is a network of churches around the country who create a center at the church. So it's a church-based center. It's ongoing activities in a set-aside space in the church. That's a 24/7 church-based center. The projects, the centers are led by asylum seekers. So the boards of the centers, the people who make the decisions about them, are at least half asylum seekers. But they're with church volunteers. So you have asylum seekers and church volunteers working together to lead the Welcoming Church centers. They do a number of special programs for youth. They were really started during the surge of unaccompanied migrant minors coming from Central America. So they have, for example, the one in Los Angeles has a yearly camp. It's like a vacation Bible school, but it's for teens. It's for unaccompanied migrant minors. These centers provide direct services and various kinds of support. They organize educational and fun events. They're usually very big on the creative arts. And the people who are coming to the center have an ongoing invitation to participate in the larger life of the church. They're not required to, but they have an invitation to do so. So the Guardian Angels Project comes out of the Lutheran Church. I was one of the people who helped create it. And it started when we had large numbers suddenly of unaccompanied migrant minors coming from Central America. And it's a court accompaniment project. So volunteers go to the court. In fact, the project started because we had a report from a lawyer of a 7-year-old who was by himself in the court with his little legs swinging under the table and completely confused because there's no automatic lawyers provided to unaccompanied migrant minors. So there are some legal services organizations that have grants to do this, but there's no requirement on the part of the state to provide these lawyers. So we decided that we would go to court, that we would accompany the migrant minors and their family members if they had family members, that we would pray for them, that we would monitor how they were treated. We would try to refer them to lawyers if they didn't have them, and we would advocate for whatever kinds of court policy decisions would make a difference for them, to make sure that they didn't experience what at the time was called rocket docket, which was being rushed through, their case being rushed through without legal support, and then the migrant minors being deported. So we were trying to avoid rocket docket, for example, as a policy that we would advocate against. So that's the Guardian Angels Project. It started in Los Angeles, but it's national.